And welcome back to Hannity. Now that former Vice President Al Gore is $100 million richer, it's safe to say that the global warming guru is selfish, hypocritical, and has his priorities completely askew. Now, as we told you on the program last night, Gore has sold his failing left-leaning network to Al Jazeera. It's current TV, which is now going to be Al Jazeera. It was owned by the oil-rich nation of Qatar. Yes, you heard that right. The so-called defender of the environment is doing business essentially with OPEC. And that's not all. Let's not forget what Al Jazeera is known for. Now, this is the network where Osama bin Laden went when he wanted to get his message out to the world. This is the network that falsely reported on the Iraq war, the network that has been infiltrated by Iraqi spies and played footage of captured and dead U.S. soldiers. Now, the network has been a mouthpiece for al-Qaeda, and the former vice president of the United States is now facilitating its expansion into 40 million American homes. Something's wrong with this picture. Joining me now with reaction, former Al Jazeera anchor David Marash. He was also with Nightline for years, and ACT for American President Brigitte Gabriel. Welcome to the program. You worked how long for the network?
For Al Jazeera, a little more than 2 years.
Okay. There are conflicting quotes. You said in part your exit was due in part to an anti-American bias at the network, and you seem to kind of back off those remarks.
Well, the anti-American bias was in many ways more personal than editorial, although there were editorial differences. You know, like every news organization, Al Jazeera has its point of view. And its point of view is post-colonial, anti-colonial. And this makes them frequently hypercritical of the U.S. That's not really the ism was that as a Yank reporting to mostly British managers, I didn't feel that I could get heard, because they knew better, you know.
Okay, fair enough. Brigitte, the most recent example, I had a problem. I always felt, and there were many that felt, and once it was the tapes out there, everybody ran it, but they would originally take bin Laden's tapes and other al-Qaeda leader tapes, and they would air them. Now, everybody else would pick up on them, so we've got to be fair, but it was always a concern of mine whether or not there was a message in those tapes that could trigger some type of terror cell in America. Is that a fair observation?
Well, just remember, Osama bin Laden ran to Al Jazeera anytime he wanted to air his message. So that tells you something about Al Jazeera. Actually, his courier used to pick up to deliver the tape personally to Al Jazeera, who later has been arrested and convicted for links as an agent for Al-Qaeda. Al Jazeera is nothing more than a propaganda mouthpiece for a foreign government operating right now in the United States, hoping to reach millions of Americans in order to influence policy and influence the American voter. This is why we are very concerned.
All right, Dave, let me give you the most recent example of what I would consider.
All right, but I really do have to interject a few things there. Number one, it isn't like Osama bin Laden would call up and say, I have a tape, run it. He would get tapes to them, and they would treat it as, guess what, news, because the guy was a newsmaker in their region. And they would take his tapes, and they would always edit them. They never just ran them. They would cut out what they thought were the most important parts and run them, and then they would analyze them and critique them. And let me say that if Osama bin Laden had ever achieved power, probably the first people he would have lined up and shot were the people from Al Jazeera, who are very much his enemies.
Well, he kept going back to them.
I have to disagree with that because I have to disagree with that because the founders of Al Jazeera, the Emir of Qatar, is a supporter of terrorism. He just recently gave $400 million generous donation to Hamas, and this was just last October. He has been a supporter of Al-Qaeda, which makes Qatar basically a state sponsor of terrorism. So we know where their loyalty lies. This is also the same Al Jazeera that reported that the Muslims were not responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attack in the United States. They were airing different conspiracy theories. This is also the same Al Jazeera that our own State Department talks about. They're the government controlling basically the messages that are coming out of the network.
Dave, let me throw a couple of things, recent examples, news examples at you. Now, Hamas has a charter. In their charter, it calls for the destruction of Israel. The recent assassination of the head of Hamas was reported on Al Jazeera as an assassination. We have a war going on in Afghanistan. They accused President Obama of assassination for electoral reasons.
Well, when you say they,
meaning Al Jazeera.
Yeah, one of their very radical commentators, and here we're talking, by the way, about Al Jazeera Arabic. And Al Jazeera English is an entirely different entity with a different editorial policy from Arabic. And I remember when I first got hired by Al Jazeera, Bill O'Reilly, your colleague, had me on, and he was going on and on about all of the things that Al Jazeera Arabic had done, and I said, we're talking about a different channel here, and he didn't want to hear it until I reminded him that Star News, owned by Rupert Murdoch, had gone on its knees to the communist regime in China, and Bill's response to that was, well, Star News is a different channel. My point exactly.
Is it funded by the same person?
It is funded by the royal family of Qatar. They do fund developmental projects in Hamas-run Gaza. They do support the Muslim Brotherhood government, but this does not necessarily...
Muslim Brotherhood, a terror organization. They called the... they called the Israelis, they accused them of an assassination of a terrorist. They accused our president of doing it for electoral reasons. And one other reason...
the military head of the Hamas wing. I mean, there's no other word for it. Targeted killing, you.
And their star correspondent in Kabul and Iraq was sentenced to 7 years in prison after he was found guilty of collaborating with al-Qaeda.
This was a very sort of shaky money laundering case. He had actually brought some money in and brought it to a source. This was an unprofessional and stupid thing to do, but it was not reflected in his reporting. And Al Jazeera English is not in any way a supporter of terrorism.
But it's still anti-American, in your words.
I said hypercritical sometimes.
All right, last word, Brigitte, go ahead. Brigitte?
They talk from both sides of their mouth. They are anti-American, they are anti-Semitic, and they are just going to try to influence the American public. They play us like a violin.
All right, guys, thank you both for being with us. Good to see you.